What if some of the greatest fantasy movies ever made didn't fail because they were bad, but because the world simply wasn't ready for them? What if imagination went too far ahead of its time, leaving these films stranded between eras? Fantasy is supposed to last forever, and yet some stories quietly disappeared, buried by timing, marketing, or misunderstanding. Stay with me, because by the end of this list, you may realize that the most magical worlds aren't lost at all. They're just waiting to be rediscovered. Number 15, Hawk the Slayer, 1980. This is the kind of fantasy movie that feels like it came straight out of a childhood imagination before rules existed. Hawk the Slayer does not pretend to be polished or modern. It is bold, earnest, and completely unafraid of its own imagination. At the time of release, fantasy was still finding its footing on screen. Audiences expected either serious myth or playful adventure. This film sat awkwardly between both, and that confusion cost it attention. The story follows a quiet hero carrying grief and purpose, traveling through forests and stone halls with a group of unlikely companions. What makes Hawk the Slayer stand out is not realism. It is commitment. Every costume, every glowing effect, every dramatic pause feels sincere. There is no irony here. The movie believes in itself completely, and that confidence is rare. Critics dismissed it quickly, calling it low budget or overly dramatic. But time has been kinder. Fans now appreciate its handmade feel and straightforward storytelling. It feels like fantasy before it became crowded with noise and speed. There is space to breathe here, space to imagine. This movie vanished because it did not fit into a neat box, but that is also why it survives. Hawk the Slayer is not a joke, not a parody, and not an epic spectacle. It is pure fantasy spirit, unfiltered and unashamed. Number 14, The Thief of Baghdad, 1940. This film should be mentioned in every conversation about fantasy cinema, and yet, somehow, it isn't. The Thief of Baghdad is not just old, it is foundational. Flying carpets, towering creatures, enchanted cities, magical transformations. Much of what modern fantasy takes for granted started here. At the time, audiences were amazed. The visuals felt impossible. The colors were rich, the sets massive, the imagination limitless. But as decades passed, newer effects replaced older wonders. The film slowly slipped from the spotlight, not because it lost value, but because it became history. What makes this movie special is how joyful it is. It understands fantasy as adventure and emotion, not just spectacle. The characters are clear, the stakes easy to follow, and the sense of wonder never fades. Even now, the visuals hold power because they were created with creativity instead of shortcuts. The problem is visibility. Modern viewers rarely stumble upon this film unless they are searching for it. It lives quietly online, waiting. Once you see it, you understand how much fantasy owes to it. This movie did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because it became too important, then too old, then too forgotten. And that might be the strangest fate of all. Number 13, Return to Oz, 1985. This is not the Oz people expected, and that is exactly why it disappeared. Return to Oz arrived carrying the weight of a beloved legacy, but it chose a different path. Instead of warmth and comfort, it leaned into unease and imagination that felt unpredictable. The world is broken. Familiar faces are changed. The magic feels unstable. For younger viewers, it was confusing. For older viewers, it felt too intense. But here's the truth. This movie is brave. It treats fantasy as something strange and powerful, not soft and reassuring. The visuals are unforgettable. The settings feel dreamlike in an unsettling way. And the central character feels more human, more vulnerable than before. This is fantasy that reflects fear and resilience instead of pure joy. Because it did not match expectations, it was quietly pushed aside. No long-running conversation, no major revival, just a slow fade. Now, decades later, audiences are rewatching it with fresh eyes. What once felt wrong now feels bold. Return to Oz did not fail. It challenged comfort. And fantasy often struggles when it does that too early. Number 12, Time Bandits, 1981. Time Bandits is playful on the surface and surprisingly thoughtful underneath. It looks like a wild adventure filled with jumping through worlds and chasing treasures. but it is also quietly asking big questions about imagination, authority, and growing up. That double nature confused people. Was it for kids or adults? Was it silly or serious? The answer was both, and that made it difficult to sell. The film follows a young boy swept into a chaotic journey through history with a group of unpredictable travelers. Each stop feels different. Each world has its own tone. The movie refuses to settle into one mood, and that unpredictability is its strength. At the time, audiences wanted clear rules. This movie refused to provide them. It moves fast, then slow. It jokes, then reflects. It feels like imagination running freely without a guide. Because of that, it slipped through the cracks, not forgotten entirely, but never fully embraced. Today, it feels ahead of its time. Bandits understands that fantasy does not need permission to be strange, it just needs confidence. And this movie has plenty of it. Number 11. Dragonslayer, 1981. Dragonslayer arrived quietly and left even quieter. And that is a shame, because this is one of the most grounded fantasy films ever made. Instead of flashy heroes and easy victories, this movie feels heavy. The world feels lived in. The danger feels real. Magic is not playful here. It is risky, exhausting, and uncertain. That seriousness set it apart at a time when fantasy was leaning lighter. The creature effects were groundbreaking, but they were not marketed loudly. The story focused on tension instead of humor, and audiences did not know what to do with it. Over time, Dragonslayer earned respect. Filmmakers praised its atmosphere. Fans admired its restraint. It feels closer to legend than spectacle. This film vanished because it refused to shout. It whispered, and sometimes whispers take longer to be heard. Number 10. Legend, 1985. Legend is one of those fantasy films that looks unforgettable, but somehow slipped through memory anyway. Visually, it is stunning. Every frame feels painted, forests glow, shadows stretch, and the world feels suspended between dream and nightmare. But when it arrived, audiences did not know what to make of it. The story is simple on purpose: light and darkness, innocence and temptation, a journey shaped more by atmosphere than plot twists. That choice confused people expecting a fast adventure. Add in studio changes and different versions released in different places, and the film lost its identity before it could settle. What saves Legend now is time. Viewers can finally watch it without expectations. And when they do, the craft becomes impossible to ignore. The set design feels handmade, the performances lean into myth instead of realism, and the villain is one of the most striking fantasy figures ever put on screen. Legend vanished because it arrived during a shift. Fantasy was becoming louder and faster. This film wanted silence, mood, and patience. Back then, that felt like a flaw. Now, it feels like courage. Number 9. The City of Lost Children, 1995. This movie feels like stepping into someone else's dream and realizing you cannot leave. The City of Lost Children is dark, imaginative, and completely unlike anything else. Its world feels stitched together from strange ideas and emotional weight. The story centers on a lonely figure who cannot dream and the strange city around him. Children disappear, machines hum. The setting feels alive and uncomfortable. This is fantasy that leans into unease instead of comfort. When it was released, the style was too bold for many viewers. The pacing felt unusual. The visuals felt overwhelming. And because it did not fit familiar fantasy rules, it never reached a wide audience. But those who found it never forgot it. Every detail feels intentional. Costumes, colors, sound, and movement work together to create a world that feels handmade and personal. It does not rush to explain itself. It trusts you to keep up. This film vanished not because it lacked quality, but because it demanded attention. Fantasy often invites escape. This one invites confrontation, and that made it harder to sell, but impossible to replace. Number 8. Excalibur, 1981. Excalibur does not feel like a movie made to please everyone. It feels like a legend carved into stone. Heavy, serious, unapologetic. This retelling of the Arthur story leans into myth instead of adventure. Armor shines like symbols. Words feel ceremonial. Actions carry weight. There is very little humor here, and that turned many viewers away at the time. But what Excalibur does well, it does completely. It treats its story with respect. The world feels ancient and dangerous. Power is not glamorous. Leadership feels like a burden. That tone was unusual for fantasy films trying to entertain broad audiences. Because it did not soften its edges, it faded from casual conversation. But among fans, it never disappeared. Watching it now feels refreshing. It trusts silence. It trusts imagery. It trusts the audience to listen. Excalibur vanished because it refused to compromise. And sometimes, that is exactly what keeps a story alive beneath the surface. Number 7. The Dark Crystal, 1982. This film confused people from the very beginning. It looked like a children's movie, but it did not behave like one. The Dark Crystal builds a full fantasy world with no shortcuts, no familiar faces, no easy humor, no clear comfort. Everything feels alien and ancient. The creatures speak seriously. The stakes feel heavy. The tone is quiet and intense. For many viewers, especially younger ones, it was overwhelming. For adults, it felt too strange. That left it stuck in between audiences. And yet, its craftsmanship is undeniable. The world feels alive. Every movement is deliberate. Every setting feels thought through. It is fantasy built with patience and care. Over time, appreciation grew. Fans recognized how ambitious it was, how rare it is to see fantasy that does not explain itself constantly. The Dark Crystal vanished because it trusted imagination more than familiarity. And imagination, when pushed this far, can scare people. But it can also last forever. Number 6. The Last Unicorn, 1982. This film looks gentle, and that gentleness is exactly why it was misunderstood. The Last Unicorn arrives without noise or urgency. It does not rush to impress you. It waits. From the first moments, the story moves at its own pace, trusting that you are willing to slow down and listen. On the surface, it feels like a soft animated fantasy with calm colors and graceful movement. But underneath that softness is a story shaped by loss, time, and the fear of being forgotten. The film speaks quietly, not because it lacks confidence, but because it understands that some emotions only work when they are allowed to breathe. It never explains everything. It lets meaning unfold naturally. When it first appeared, it was marketed too simply. Many younger viewers were not ready for its emotional weight, and many adults passed it by, assuming it was not meant for them. That misunderstanding costed attention at the time. Years later, people return to it and finally see what was always there. The animation feels delicate but intentional. The characters feel honest and thoughtful. Every scene carries a sense of reflection that stays with you long after it ends. This movie did not fade away because it lacked heart. It faded because it whispered when others were shouting. And sometimes, the quietest fantasy is the one that stays with you the longest. Number 5. Ladyhawke, 1985. Ladyhawke is a fantasy built on feeling rather than spectacle. It tells a tragic story of love, timing, and separation, wrapped in medieval imagery that feels both grounded and poetic. The core idea is simple. Two people are bound together, yet never fully allowed to share the same moment. That emotional hook is powerful, but it did not fit expectations when the film arrived. Audiences were unsure how to read it. It was not loud. It was not fast. And it leaned heavily into mood and emotion instead of constant action. That made it feel different from other fantasy films of the era. Over time, that difference became its strength. The performances feel sincere. The story unfolds patiently. And the sense of longing never fades. The film trusts the viewer to feel the weight of every quiet moment. What really stands out now is how timeless it feels. The themes still land. The story still works. And the emotional core feels honest. Ladyhawke did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because it was gentle in a genre that was becoming louder, and gentle stories often need time to be appreciated. Number 4. The Company of Wolves, 1984. This film feels like a story told at night, when imagination runs freely and rules fade away. The Company of Wolves is not traditional fantasy. It blends folklore, dream logic, and symbolism into something deeply unusual. There is no rush here. Scenes unfold slowly. Images linger. The story feels layered, almost like multiple tales woven together. That approach confused audiences expecting a clear adventure. But that is exactly what makes it unforgettable. The visuals are striking, the atmosphere is thick, and the storytelling feels more like a dream than a plot. It invites interpretation instead of answers. When it was released, it felt too strange to categorize, not light enough to be playful, not direct enough to be thrilling, so it quietly slipped away. Now, it stands as a bold example of fantasy that dares to be symbolic. It treats imagination as something powerful and unpredictable. This movie vanished because it refused to explain itself. And sometimes, the most memorable fantasy stories are the ones that trust you to find your own meaning. Number 3. Time Bandits, 1981. Time Bandits may look like a chaotic adventure, but it hides a thoughtful heart beneath the surface. It jumps through worlds, ideas, and tones with confidence, refusing to settle into one shape. That unpredictability made it difficult to market. Was it playful or reflective, fast or thoughtful? The answer was all of the above. The story follows a young boy pulled into a strange journey across time with a group that feels both silly and sincere. Each stop feels different. Each moment adds another layer. What sets this film apart is its willingness to mix humor with reflection. It never talks down to its audience. It assumes curiosity. It assumes imagination. Because of that, it slipped past mainstream attention. It did not fit neatly into one audience group. Now, it feels refreshing. It embraces fantasy as freedom. Freedom to explore, question, and imagine without limits. Time Bandits vanished not because it lacked direction, but because it had too many ideas at once. And sometimes, that is exactly what makes a fantasy timeless. Number 2. The Dark Crystal, 1982. Few fantasy films commit as fully as this one. The Dark Crystal builds a world that feels ancient, detailed, and serious from the very first moment. It does not pause to reassure the viewer. It expects patience. At the time, that approach felt risky. There were no familiar faces, no easy jokes, no shortcuts. Everything felt deliberate and intense. That intensity pushed audiences away, but it also planted the seeds for long-term admiration. Every creature feels alive. Every setting feels purposeful. The story unfolds with care, trusting visuals over explanation. This is fantasy as world-building, not distraction. And that depth takes time to appreciate. The Dark Crystal vanished because it demanded attention instead of offering comfort. And in hindsight, that demand feels like respect for the audience. Number 1. The Last Unicorn, 1982. At the top of this list is a fantasy that quietly stays with you long after it ends. The Last Unicorn does not arrive with spectacle or urgency. It looks simple at first glance. Soft animation, gentle pacing, calm voices that never push too hard. But beneath that calm surface is a story filled with reflection, emotion, and a deep awareness of time passing. This film refuses to rush. It gives moments room to exist. Silence is not treated as emptiness, but as meaning. Scenes linger just long enough for you to feel what the characters are feeling, even when nothing is said out loud. The movie trusts you. It assumes you are paying attention, and it never talks down to you. When it first appeared, that approach worked against it. It felt too quiet, too thoughtful, too different from the louder, faster animated adventures surrounding it. Many viewers did not know how to engage with a fantasy that asked for patience instead of excitement. Years later, people return to it and realize what they missed. This is a story that treats memory and time with care. It feels personal without becoming heavy, emotional without becoming overwhelming. Every rewatch reveals something new. The Last Unicorn did not vanish because it lacked power. It vanished because it whispered instead of shouting. And sometimes, whispers are the stories that last the longest. Fantasy never truly disappears. It waits. It hides in forgotten corners, ready for the right moment to return. These films did not vanish because they lacked magic. They vanished because they arrived too early, too quietly, or too honestly. Now it's your turn. Which of these worlds are you stepping into first? Drop your thoughts below, share this with a fellow dreamer, and make sure you're subscribed because some stories don't end. They just wait for someone to remember them.